We're here at the Armagh Observatory, an incredibly historic building, apparently the oldest telescope in its original dome in the world. It's just upstairs, so it's an amazing place to be and to have a conversation, obviously not so much about the past, but about the present and about the future. And this is the third of our series of climate tour museum stops across the province that we've done this week. The first one actually was very much about politics. We had political representatives, MLAs, the former mayor of Belfast, now the climate commissioner, and we talked about how climate change is challenging communities, politicians, and so on. And last night we talked more about ecosystems, so we talked more about biodiversity and about ecology, which is probably more to the point of what we're going to talk about tonight, which I think will be probably more about agriculture, about farming. And I'm sure you can rattle off some stats, but as I understand it, something like 25% of Northern Ireland's emissions come from the agriculture sector, so it's a huge challenge and as much an opportunity, I guess, to sequester that carbon and to not just reduce those emissions, but find ways also to mitigate the problem. So I'd love to hear from each of you in turn about who you are and your area of expertise. So maybe we'll start with you, Elizabeth.
Thank you. So I am Elizabeth Magowan. I'm the Director of Sustainable Agri-Food Sciences at the Agri-Food Sciences Biosciences Institute based in Belfast. But my remit is very heavily focused at the minute on that interface between food production and the environmental impact of that food production, and how we can actually try and reduce the environmental impact of food production, especially livestock, dairy, milk and meat production. So we have a huge portfolio of work underway to both understand that, to model the effects of it, and also to understand its effects on the wider economy and societal impact, as well as our trade in Northern Ireland, whilst all the time remembering that the farmer's at the core of this as well, and we have to give him tools, him and her, tools to actually improve their sustainability at a farm level, at farmer scale, catchment scale, and Northern Ireland as a whole.
Mm-hmm. Amazing, thank you. Who's your next, Peter?
Okay, thank you. Peter McEvoy, Director of Land Management at Ulster Wildlife. And I suppose for a bit of context, unlike my two colleagues, I don't come from a farming background, but I never managed to escape farming. When I was 19 years old, I was a long-haired vegetarian with a nose ring who fell in love with botany. You didn't know that, Kevin, I don't think, but so I became a plant ecologist. I'm fascinated by rare habitats and rare species. And very quickly I realised that all these amazing grasslands were managed by farmers. And so I was looking at some people climb a career ladder, I climbed the food chain, I suppose. So I was looking at the grass, and I realised the cow was the thing that made the grass the way I wanted it. And then you realise, well, somebody owns that cow, so why do they keep the cow? And then you start getting into the economics of farming and the social side of it. Anyway, I moved to the Isle of Man to do this job, and somehow managed to become Director of Agriculture over 5 or 6 years, and was running a flour mill and responsible for dairy policy and setting the price of milk, and a director of an abattoir as well. So I went from being a plant ecologist to understanding the nuts and bolts of agriculture, and now I've crashed back down the other side in a way, and I'm working and living in West Fermanagh, looking at the best habitats we've got and working with farmers to make sure that they have a life, a social life, and an income, and can understand the habitats that they've got, and that they'll be there for generations to come. So, bit of a long answer, but
no, that's perfect.
That's the context.
We've already got a lot to talk about, but first, Kevin.
Okay, well, I'm the Land Use and Farm Advisor for the National Trust, but just to give a bit of background to myself, I've grew up in a working farm in the Glens of Antrim. It's a beef and sheep farm, and kind of from a very early age I've always understood that farmers are the custodians and their land, and the reason that the landscape is so beautiful in Northern Ireland is thanks to how farmers have managed it. And my granda always said to me, it was the wee robins in the hedge, if you look after them, they'll look after you, and that kind of inspired me to go on the kind of the career path that I have. So I actually used to work as a research scientist for ADAS over in Cambridge, and I did very similar work to Elizabeth, however down the career pegging ladder, but it was very much focused on how can we deliver sustainable land management options to give farmers the tools that they need to deliver better for nature and climate change. But my job within the National Trust is to deliver its sustainable land management vision, and that's working with external partners and nearly 80 farmers across the 6 properties in Northern Ireland to deliver and create carbon-rich habitats, but also looking at how can we integrate trees into that landscape, species-rich meadows, which you can capture lots of carbon, and also more into things like herbicides and that type both thing. But also a big part of my role is working with people like Peter on the policy front, and how do we ensure that there's the correct frameworks and support measures for farmers to try and do the things that we want to do. But my real passion is trying to find the sweet spot, which I do believe that there is, and the works that Elizabeth is doing at AFBI is trying to find those sweet spots for farmers, that they can be productive, but productive in a landscape scale in terms of nature and carbon and clean water and all those things. So it's trying to find that balance that ticks the boxes for everyone, and I do think we have the tools to get there, and it's working together, and having discussions like this will help us get there.
Let's hope so. Well, before we get into the details, can you maybe, Elizabeth, give us a summary of the kind of sort of relationship between farming and climate change, at least as it relates to Northern Ireland? Like, what are the emissions? Where are they from? It's not just carbon, is it? There's a bunch of things. So can you just give us a sort of sense of the scale of it?
Yeah. Okay, so we have an agricultural industry that is predominantly livestock based, and even within that livestock agenda, predominantly dairy, beef and sheep. That in itself then does create a significant pressure with regards to carbon, methane emissions in particular, nitrous oxide emissions whenever it comes to greenhouse gas emissions. Also, and that contributes, it's about 25 to 27% of emissions in Northern Ireland, of greenhouse gas emissions in Northern Ireland, are attributable to agriculture production. Then with regards to ammonia emissions, unfortunately the agricultural industry is responsible for upward of 85 to 90% of the emissions of ammonia in Northern Ireland. And
ammonia is a problem because it contributes to nitrous oxides, or what? Because it's not a direct greenhouse gas, ammonia, as NH3,
it's an indirect greenhouse gas. But the challenge with regards to ammonia is the fact that it does, it causes problems in our natural habitats, in our peatlands and boglands, especially where we really want to promote biodiversity. But unfortunately, ammonia, most of the ammonia, it just travels a very short distance, probably 7.5 to 10 kilometres from its source. It can travel further, but that's in the minority of it. So therefore it's a local problem. And that is the difference between greenhouse gases and ammonia. And then the third challenge we have is around our phosphorus and our phosphorus balance, as we call it in Northern Ireland, in that we are importing quite a significant amount of phosphorus in feed and fertiliser for, yes, the pig and poultry world, but also the dairy world. And as a result, our phosphorus balance is out of balance, if you like, and our soils actually contain quite a significant amount of phosphorus, and therefore the more we bring in, the heavier that balance becomes, and that is affecting water quality and eutrophication, especially in your Lough Neagh and water quality. So think about 30%, guys, you can keep me right, 30% of our waterways is considered good, but that means a significant portion isn't considered good. So as I say, carbon, whilst ammonia and phosphorus are local issues in Northern Ireland, what we bring in and we're affecting our local, the carbon one, whilst it is a local problem, it also is a global problem, and that's the conundrum that we sometimes have, that those greenhouse gases go up and they contribute to the global piece, whereas ammonia and phosphorus are more, can be managed, and we'll see the impact of managing them better at a local level. But unfortunately, the challenge for us is the fact that we have both greenhouse gases in the form of methane, especially, and nitrous oxide, as well as ammonia, as well as phosphorus, all to really tackle in combination. And this is where that sweet spot isn't only about how we produce food alongside this, but how we produce food and actually reduce all three of those pieces in tandem, because there are interventions where you could reduce one and actually be detrimental to the other. Thankfully, they're not that common, those ones, but we just have to be mindful of making sure that...
It might mean reducing livestock, though. I mean, certainly there's a lot of movement towards more plant-based diets, both for health reasons and as part of a sort of broader land-sparing, agenda. And because I think there's a growing recognition that sheep grazing in particular in the uplands has caused a lot of ecological devastation. I'm sure you could speak to that. And that the uplands are not as wildlife rich or as ecologically diverse as they perhaps once were, and perhaps they should be.
So I think it's easy to kind of focus on the livestock element of it. Kind of what I would say is that there is a reform needed across all farming systems, and it's not just livestock systems, because yes, they can be a big emitter of carbon and methane, but so can the arable farm in terms of CO2 if not done well. So kind of what I feel in terms of what I do in the day job is trying to look at the farming system and look at core principles of focus on soil health and regenerative farming. I think that's the way to go, because if you focus just on the livestock, you're not going to get the gains that you need if you don't change the other things that are happening within the system, like applying too much fertilizer, bringing in the concentrates. You need to look at the livestock systems, and it's the same with the uplands. Yes, at certain points in time, due to past policy measures, there was too many sheep in the uplands, but we still need sheep at a certain degree to deliver the rich habitats that we need, because if you didn't graze them, you wouldn't have the biodiversity that you need. So there is trying to find that balance in farming systems that deliver the best outcomes. But I would just add as well, there's a great need in the UK in general to increase access to these green spaces for mental health issues and well-being, and that's something that particularly the trust that we focus on. So it's trying to tick all those boxes, because there's a massive issue of a disconnect from where food comes from, so people don't appreciate it and they don't value it. So that's something I'm very passionate about, that getting people to realise the difference in healthy food and food that's mass produced, and in Northern Ireland, we're very much on the leading front in terms of being as sustainable as we can be. We are working to better targets, but we are pretty green in terms of our output per head. And Elizabeth, you could say more facts and figures on that, but I think we're doing pretty well.
I mean, give us the ecologist perspective on this issue.
Yeah, well, Northern Ireland, it suits pastoral agriculture, or you mentioned plant-based diets, and clearly there is a move towards that, but globally there's an increase in demand for animal-based proteins. And so, taking aside the ethics of that or anything else, if the world wants it, where is the best place to produce it? And arguably Ireland and similar climates have the lowest carbon footprint to do that. Now, I'm only half answering your question, because from an ecology point of view, and Kevin answered this, historically the uplands have been overgrazed, and there's no doubt in places they still are, but we actually see the similar issues of land abandonment, undergrazing, fire becoming an issue. The obvious kind of thought process would be, that's great, it'll turn into woodland.
Yeah, we'd say that's rewilding. What's not to know?
Yeah, well, it's hard to define rewilding, and I know it sets alarm buttons, certainly with farmers and other people. And it's actually quite hard to define, but if you throw that word out, you will create panic. But to me, rewilding means identifying natural processes and allowing them to happen. It doesn't mean you're not intervening. So a large herbivore is part of rewilding. It's not abandonment.
Yeah.
Now, and it's at low density, there's no doubt. I think we'd probably all agree, on the density side, but it's not land abandonment, that's not rewilding. So you need herbivores. Sheep are not a native herbivore. Cattle are more so. So how they poach the ground, how they tear vegetation and browse trees and shrubs is better for biodiversity than a lot of sheep on the hill all year.
And horses would be native, deer would be native.
Yeah. So and again, it's a question of numbers.
You need large carnivores though to keep the
arguably so, and then therein lies another agricultural panic when that gets mentioned. So it's not simple, but these habitats are man-made. Upland heath, blanket bog, they're designated, they're of global importance.
Give me a quick potted view of the bog then.
Yeah.
So I've got this sort of this probably wrong idea that bogs were a sort of anthropogenic landscape, that originally it was all forest and somehow it's been cleared and the bogs have come about. Do we know whether bogs are original, like since the beginning of the whole?
It's a combination of climate and human interaction, and probably there's a difference in a raised bog. And I'm sure last night when you were with my colleague Simon, you're a peatland expert. So raised bogs are basically a lake that infills and grows over time. But the blanket bogs in the uplands formed through a climatic cold snap, which would have killed the trees and left this iron pan, which allowed the water to rise and it got more acidic. But people cutting down trees and farming and at that same time contributed to it. So they're I don't know, we accept that they're a really important carbon sequestration tool and a very important upland habitat, and therefore from an ecology perspective we try to preserve and manage them rather than seeing them succeed to birchwood or oakwood or whatever it might be.
That would dry the bog out, so it would have the opposite effect of releasing more methane and CO2. So in a lot of cases across the UK, bogs were planted up because that was the policy measures, but we've now realised the rights were wrong, so a lot of the work that we do in conservation organisations is now taking those trees out and trying to block up the dams, which you would have learnt about last night. But those landscapes still need to be farmed, yes, on a lower scale, but it's still important that there is farmers there to do that, and how we support them, because working in that landscape is a very tough landscape to start with, never mind everything else that's come on, the pressures with climate change, and even on my own farm, the droughts that we've had, and how me and my father are now having to think differently about what we do in the farm. And that's the same across the beast. I'm home from England now for 8 years, and there's been a drastic change in how the summers are drying up and how we're needing to think about things differently. My dad's nearly 60 and the river never dried up. It did last year. So it's simple things like this, like climate change is real. There's no denying it, but we have to find ways to innovate, which is we're very thankful that we have AFBI in Northern Ireland to be leading on these things.
I mean the thing is, this is probably the most complicated area of the whole climate issue. I mean, transport fine, we can do electric cars or move to hydrogen, whatever. So you can sort of map out what the problem is and what the sort of potential, at least technological solutions are, and other shifts that are needed. But with agriculture, it's so multidimensional because you're producing food. You've got all these other nutrient issues as well. You've got water, you've got land use, you've got biodiversity pressures. You've got the fact that this is all happening in the context of rapid change in the climate, like you were mentioning, that the summers are drying up, the winters are warming up, and so the farming systems and patterns that have been predominant before aren't even going to be appropriate for the coming century. How do you kind of figure out a sort of strategic, smart way through all of this complexity?
So, well, I think we have to understand where the baseline is first of all, and I think we have not a bad handle on that. Having said that, the carbon story in grasslands is something that, especially for Northern Ireland, we do need to have more work on, and the big soil scheme that, to be fair, DAERA is investing millions in will help us get a better handle on how much carbon is in our soils, and over the passage of time, how much carbon can those soils sequester. So that's one level. And then, we're looking at technologies, and whenever I say technologies, multi-species swards, it's using your pasture, it's using your clovers, good old clovers back, and even your plantains that are more deep rooting to help with those drought spells. And then you move into the technology world, and whenever it comes to technology, there are additives coming through to reduce methane emissions from the animals. And from an ammonia perspective, again, dietary interventions can reduce the nitrogen that's in the diet, and especially how it's tailored to improve the efficiency and how it's metabolised in the animal. And then the story out the other end, there's a lot of technologies at play at the minute with, whenever it comes to trying to take methane off the slurry, anaerobic digestion, for example, put that back into the grid as biomethane or into tractors, etc. And then even extract the phosphorus from that product as well. So there are lots of technologies. Now, they come at a cost, and that's the other big challenge then. How much is society willing to pay for environmental protection?
But there's also some policy disconnect, I think. So you mentioned electric cars and other sectors, and agriculture can contribute to those sectors through creation of short rotation coppers, putting electric or PV panels on roofs and things. But unfortunately, they do not contribute to agriculture's race to net zero. That contributes to those other sectors. So there needs to be more acknowledgement. I mean, there's no doubt agriculture has a big job to do, and its headline is there as the biggest emitter. it's also the biggest emitter because Ireland and Northern Ireland doesn't have other big industry, arguably as well. You know, so it increases the percentage of the pie, but it is our biggest industry, so it has to adopt. You know, it has to do its fair share, but I actually think it has to do more than its fair share in this instance because it is such a big industry.
Well, I mean, it's an opportunity to be part of the solution, right, in terms of sequestering carbon.
100%. Yeah.
But I mean, I've looked at the science on this, and it seems really all over the place in terms of what kinds of soils even, or what kinds of habitats even sequester the most carbon. Like,
Absolutely.
a lot of people say the grasslands are fairly carbon poor, then you've got the livestock people say they're quite carbon rich, and the woodlands are quite carbon poor.
Yeah.
It's like, is it just all over the place, or can you see some kind of patterns here?
And you're walking into the land use change agenda now, and this is where agriculture has, in the inventory, you're right about those sectors. Now, I would argue that, you know, at an inventory level, as long as we get to net zero at an inventory as a whole, you know, then it's about marketing agriculture and its carbon footprinting. But that figure of 27% from agriculture is purely the emissions that come up from, you know, the nitrous oxide, the methane from the animals and from the fertiliser application. Then the land use change is the other part of the inventory that actually counts the sequestration piece. And that is, there are gaps in knowledge there, and there is data there needing to be attained to enhance what we call the emission factors in that inventory. So that is probably the weakest part of the inventory, I would say, at the minute at a national level.
But if we're going to pay farmers for carbon sequestration,
exactly.
You've got to know, you know, how can you pay for something you can't quantify?
Exactly. The carbon market agenda scares the life out of me, to be honest, not only from a lack of regulation generally, but
it's
also
the Wild
from
West at the minute.
But effectively because we don't know the carbon emission factor of multi-species swards or, you know, agroforestry in all those regenerative practices that we're talking
about.
about.
What do you mean it's the Wild West?
So, because there's no, as Elizabeth said, no proper regulation on it. So, at the minute, for a farmer to sell his carbon, it's not that well regulated. I feel they don't really know what they're getting into.
You default to a typical standard for carbon credits, where it's not.
Which the issue is, if you've a young family coming along, you've kind of sold their ambition for the farm long term, because then it gets locked in for 100 years, if I understand. But if anything happens in the farm, well, then are you liable because that habitat, the woodland that you said was going to catch it, is now gone? So it's a very grey area, and what I believe is that the farmer needs that carbon to offset his own emissions, and if you've sold it away, where's that going to leave you? So it is a very tricky area that farmers do need to be, land managers need to be very careful about, and it's all kind of been spurred on by somebody in Australia selling carbon to Microsoft, and it's set off a global transition. But just back to the farmers being like a solution, that's something I'm particularly passionate about, and by changing simple practices of even grazing on the farm by having rotational grazing has been shown to capture like a lot of carbon, but also the farmers getting better utilisation with no fertiliser. So there is a long...
Explain that process.
So you'd say this is a field and you'd have it set up like in squares, so it's kind of high impact grazing, so you could call it mob grazing, where the animals graze for a short period of time but quickly, and then you move them on like rapidly. So that grass also gets a long rest period, so it's capturing more carbon, sending it into the soil, but because you're not grazing it as hard as you would in a set stocking system, the leaves are there to come back, so kind of grass grows grass, but also the dung's getting concentrated in those paddocks, and then you move around the system. So that's been shown to be really effective at capturing carbon, but it's a relatively new practice in terms of science studying in it to have the research to kind of prove the concepts that we're talking about. But that is how animals would have grazed back in the day in savanna grasslands. You would have apex predators chasing them around. Exactly. So we're only trying to replicate what happened in the past. So a lot of what we are innovating is actually looking at the past to go forward. So
we can't quantify carbon. But can we quantify?
We can quantify carbon. We just haven't invested heavily enough in actually.
So it's a solvable problem, but how can we ever quantify biodiversity?
Well, that's a challenge. And before I even try to broach that subject, I think the worry about having the uncertainty around carbon is that policymakers will go for the lowest common denominator, so something like planting trees, where you've got better metrics and you can count each tree. So you could fence a field off and allow it to naturally regenerate, and you maybe catch as much carbon as you would by planting it, arguably more, because you're not putting petrochemicals and disturbing the soil and tree guards and things. But that's harder to count. Whereas if you plant 1,000 trees and you look at the equation, you can say in 10 years they'll be tick. So I do worry that will, the answer for biodiversity isn't as simple, but that is, tree planting is simple. So there's a risk that biodiversity gets left behind and policies become more and more carbon based because it's easier to quantify and biodiversity is tricky, so it gets left behind.
You can't just say it's impossible.
No, it's not impossible. No, you can't do it, and I think there's been some really good progress made in terms of rewarding farmers for biodiversity, particularly in the Republic of Ireland with results-based agri-environment schemes. It's happened in England too, to a smaller extent. I think the National Trust have tried some amongst others. Where basically you focus on the habitat rather than the species, because in theory it's there all the time in that field, and you tell the farmer what you want to achieve, whether it be the number of species or a particular flower that flowers in August or whatever it is, and the more of that target attribute you have, the more you get paid, and you're empowering the farmer to look at his land and appreciate that as a productive output. So it's not litres of milk or kilos of beef, it's biodiversity. And they know what they are looking for, and you're not telling them how to farm it. You're saying, I want more of that, and the farmer then works out how to do it.
But somebody's got to pay for that.
Yes, and that's where government policy comes in, and agri-environment schemes have been around since the late 1980s. But up until now, really, they have been, you do this and we pay you. So you take animals off, you put animals on at a prescribed rate.
And no one visits the farm to see what the impact is.
They do, but the farmer's not necessarily engaged because he knows, or he or she knows, you put the animals on the 1st of May and take them off on the 31st of December, I've got paid. But they don't know why they're doing it. They're following a recipe. Whereas if you say, I want those 10 species of flowers to be in your field when I come and visit in August, they're saying, well, what is it? Why is it there? How does that work? What is my grazing impact? The ownership and understanding. You're turning farmers into ecologists, and in fact they are ecologists anyway. To me, they know a lot, but you're actually engaging that side of their business.
I mean, you can presumably with the National Trust look at best practice now.
Yeah, well, that's our kind of bread and butter, and what I'm particularly passionate about. Because I come from the research kind of background too, when I first came over to Northern, and I try and set up like demonstration farms, not run to Elizabeth standard, but it's, anecdotally, we're trying to showcase simple measures of how we be more carbon friendly, deliver biodiversity, and then bring other farmers, other parties and the public in to see this kind of happening. Because one parts of our strategy that I didn't and you mentioned is beyond our boundaries. It's no good but me doing what I do in little isolation of Northern Ireland. We need to join up the dots, have more farmers doing this across the landscape. But back to what Peter was talking about, doing it on a payment for outcomes type approach helps do that on a bigger scale. Farmers know what they're doing and can see how they can connect into their neighbours. And the trust projects that were run, it was unbelievable that farmers over the hedge were arguing over the number of butterflies. People would say that's impossible. And if it's not, we kind of showed that if you give the farmers the right encouragement and the right empowerment, they can deliver these things. But as a farmer myself, I think for too long we've focused just solely on food production. We deliver so many more things, but we've never thought about it like that. A nice countryside, clean air, all the things that we do, and I think we as farmers need to value that better before society will start valuing it. So I think we have a piece of work to do ourselves in that picture.
Amazing. So we solved the carbon problem, we solved the biodiversity problem. Are you close to solving the ammonia phosphorus issue?
Technology will solve ammonia and phosphorus.
Give me a couple of minutes on how.
So, well, first of all, ammonia, the less nitrogen you put into an animal, the less you're going to get out. Now, having said that, nitrogen is the building block of protein in an animal, so you can't take it out, but you can tailor it in such a way that you maximise the efficiency of how that animal uses it. So reducing the crude protein and the crude nitrogen content of the diet is one strategy, and that we've proven that to be very successful in pig, poultry, and currently working on it in dairy nutrition. So then once you get the slurry out the other end, it is about making sure that the opportunity for ammonia emissions to happen in the house or in the tank is totally reduced. So it's getting it out of the house as quickly as possible and into a cover tank. Once you have it in the covered tank, it's then
not into a watercourse.
Not into a watercourse. It's then about injecting it, or dribble bar, all of those good trail and shoe techniques that maximise its ability to lock in. You've also got additives that we can add to the slurry to adjust the pH, which reduces the ability of reduces that chemistry from it being locked in the slurry to being emitted from the slurry. So I think with various interventions, and I say there's some fantastic technologies coming through that actually we can put slurry into a technology and get clean water out the other end. Now they're expensive, no doubt, but these technologies are coming through, and again it comes back to how much we can afford to invest and how much a farmer can afford to invest in. But we do have farmers out there investing in these things.
But you don't think livestock numbers overall are going to have to reduce, or do you?
I think livestock numbers are going to have to sit tight for a few years until we get ourselves on a trajectory where we're reducing our ammonia emissions, we're reducing our phosphorus excretion. We are on the pathway to a balanced pathway that's a just transition for farming when it comes to greenhouse gases. So we do need to get to a stage. At the minute we're coupled, as described, the livestock and the environment are very much coupled together at the minute, and livestock likely won't expand. I don't see that happening until we get on top of this. But I do have a confidence, I think we talked about this earlier, I have a confidence that give us another 4, 5, 6, 7 years, you're going to have technologies coming through, you're going to have farmers changing behaviours, you're going to have trees being planted, you're going to have so many things happening that we potentially will be in a position where we'll certainly be able to think, livestock, where do we go now? We'll have to take stock at that stage. But the reason I say all that is because we do have, and this is why I said at the start, carbon is a global problem. Ammonia and phosphorus are local problems. If we can address that ammonia and phosphorus, and I think technology is going to play a huge role in that, the carbon piece is a global problem, and it comes back to, should Northern Ireland feed 10 million people? You were saying we are pasture based. Yeah. This is a good place to produce a very healthy food product for society from a land mass that isn't very good at producing a food product directly.
Yes.
And but it is very good at producing grass. We've some of the highest yields and the ability to have very high yields from our grasslands in Northern Ireland. So we do, I think, have a responsibility. We're currently, UK is only 60% self-sufficient in meat, eggs and milk. So that, and with Brexit, you've seen it now in the shop shelves recently, they have a huge challenge when it comes to food security. So for me, it's not Northern Ireland, and what do you think about Northern Ireland? We do have to play our role in reducing greenhouse gas, but we have to play our role in feeding not only the globe, but UK, especially as well. So I think we have stuff to sort out for sure, but I have confidence we can do it as well.
Well, that's almost like a good place to end, I think. But I'd like to, before we wrap up, give each of you a minute or so just to give us a positive view of where you think we can go for the next 10, 20 years.
Okay, well, so Elizabeth has covered, I think, intensive production agriculture. My feet are firmly in the west on very marginal, poor land that delivers habitat. And I think there's a risk that those kind of farmers who are inefficient and unproductive in the terms you measure in, they need to be rewarded for the production of biodiversity. So you asked me the question about how do we measure it, and we've identified ways that happens. So I would love to see that coming on stream in the next couple of years. And we work with 400 farmers in the west currently, and we're in a position to try these systems with them. So I really hope that our farmers in the west are producing biodiversity as maybe their main farm output, using livestock as the tool to do so.
And you will see some of these declining species coming back?
Oh, definitely, yes, yeah. I mean, it's a hotspot for marsh fertility. The curlews are clinging on, but so yeah, we want to see those turn around. But that's global climate issue as well. So we have to buffer and make the habitats as resilient as possible.
And Kevin?
Well, for me, it's kind of what I said at the start. It's trying to find that sweet spot that the farmer is still productive and he's financially fit to farm on the land, but he's still like delivering everything else that we as society expect. And for me, it's focusing on soil health will do that. For example, herbalace can produce the same output, if not more, than ryegrass, which needs fertilizer, and there's really good research to show how that's working. So it's trying to look at what's out there and bring that to Northern Ireland and see how that fits our farming systems will kind of help us progress and be able to achieve all the things that we need to. But farmers need to be open-minded to things like herbalace and all that, and myself as a farm advisor have a job to do on how we bring the information from the likes of AFBI to the farmer and working together to get people's minds open to new ways of doing things, because farmers tend to continue on and plod along, but we are at such a crux of needing to achieve so many things that we do have to change our ways. But there's lots of good things going on in Northern Ireland that can help us do so.
Very pleased to hear it. Elizabeth?
Yeah, so I think I have huge optimism. I am an optimistic person to start with, but I do have huge optimism because the amount of investment that the government and farmers and private industry are putting into Northern Ireland agriculture at the minute is significant. We are world leading at the minute on a soil scheme which is sampling every single field in Northern Ireland for its nutrient content, and then we'll be able to establish its carbon content. We've done a LiDAR map of the whole of Northern Ireland as well, so we know the underground band.
LiDAR's the sort of satellite view, mapping.
To map, if you like, the tree coverage, the hedge coverage, effectively to establish the above ground carbon in our biomass. So that is world leading. There's nowhere else in the world doing that at a full country level. And that's a multi-million pound programme. We'll then have another multi-million pound programme coming on stream with regards to the genetic improvement of cattle, and following that then the Climate Act talks about carbon audits for all farms. So we've got funding for research, we have funding for industry to adapt new innovations, and we've already seen the National Trust behavioural change with farmers and behaviour change in your catchments and in the Upper Grand catchment that we work with. Big behavioural change there, improving water quality. So with the investment that's going in, with the knowledge that's being created, and with the farmers' willingness, and farmers are really up for this, is what I've seen. I think we have a good combination there. There's work still to do to bring it all together, but we've all the good ingredients there so far to really do a big game change in the next 10 years, I think, for Northern Ireland agriculture production.
Sounds great. Well, I've worked on climate for 23 years now, but one of the most interesting research projects I ever did was for a book I published on planetary boundaries. That was called The God Species. It was back in 2011. But what was really interesting about it was that it wasn't just climate. There was 9 issues that we had to consider. Land use, nitrogen, phosphorus was one of them, fresh water. And farming affects pretty much all of them, probably more than any other industrial sector. And of course it's absolutely vital for feeding humanity. So we can't do without it, but at the same time it has to be sustainable. And I'm just really grateful to the three of you for coming in tonight and for sharing your expertise. I've learned a lot, and I think everyone who watches this will learn a lot too. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.